In today's B lecture, we'll be discussing matching criteria in ACS. So what we're really trying to do with our matching criteria here is to be able to write rules in such a way that we properly identify, some subset of an authentication coming through ACS so that we can apply whatever the desired results for that subset of authentication is. So let's dig into ACS here. The version of ACS that we're talking about is 5.2. This is the version that you're going to see in the CCIE lab at the moment here. So this is what we're talking about, but a lot of this information really applies to pretty much any version of ACS 5. If you're ever using ICE can look at all the same type of information. If you're looking at a different radius server, the information is all there. It's just whether it has a nice way of getting at that information or not. So we'll kind of try to chunk this down to different types of, or different categories of things we would want to match on and how we would match on those pieces of information. So this is our main page in ACS. So where we're going to be focusing our time here is going to be in the access policies. So, writing a rule for our, the results of an authentication here. So we'll go ahead and we'll be using just the normal default network access. This is the normal access service used for any type of radius authentication coming into the ACS box here. And this is how things are going to look by default. We really only have two matching conditions and no rules other than just the default rule of a permit, but things aren't going to stay this way here. So the first thing that you're almost always going to do is you're going to have to click on this customize button, which is kind of right behind my head here. And this is going to allow you to choose what do we want to match on in our rules. Now you can choose up to 8 different matching categories within there. If you try to go more than that, it'll say no, that's too many. So you are limited to 8 within ACS 5 here. So first off, let's kind of look at, here's my notes. Let's say we want to match on the devices that the authentication is coming from. Is it coming from a wireless LAN controller or an autonomous AP? Is it coming from the HQ, or is it coming from some other location? So these are generically referred to as network device groups. So we already have one already in there by default, so let's get rid of this guy. The other one is the NDG device type. These are the most common 2 methods that we're going to use to match on, what did it come from or where did it come from. So if we create a rule, basically whatever piece of information you want to match on in this particular rule, you just check the box. You don't have to match on everything. You can just match on a subset of the available options here. But you can see the operator we have is either in this group, or we can say that it's not in this group, so we could include or exclude. And the groups that we have within ACS here are hierarchical, so we can have a top-end group with a number of subgroups. So you could have a group called HQ, and underneath HQ you could have building A, building B, building C. But if you wrote a rule that said, if it's in, and we go ahead and select our available options, I just have HQ at the moment. But you could say, if it's in HQ, that would include anything that says I'm in HQ, as well as any of those sub-options underneath HQ, building A, building C, building A, B, and C underneath HQ. If it's in any of those groups, it all matches this rule. Same with device types. We can identify what type of device it's coming from. Is it a wireless LAN controller? Is it an autonomous access point? Things like that. So you can get fairly specific in terms of what devices or where the devices are at, and any combination thereof as they're coming in. And with any rule, we always have to define, okay, what's the result? So if we match this rule, what should happen? And that's what our authorization profiles are for. And I'll just be using just generic permits here, because we're not really concerned with doing fancy authorization profiles within this lecture. We're just trying to match on different things. So really basic, match on the device type and its location. Now, this is the pre-can stuff, and where you would actually configure this is back up on network resources here. And I'll just go ahead and discard these for now. But as you're defining each of your devices that are going to be using ACS, I just got to be patient here. You can define a location and a device type within each network device here. So that's typically what you're going to match on. But let's say that for whatever reason, this isn't an option for you. Maybe you're using the default network device, or whatever it is, you need to get even more granular. Another option you have for things like location or device type, or even if you want to create your own little custom piece of information, you could come down to policy elements and create what's called a device filter. Now, device filter is just matching on the device that the authentication is coming from. So again, a wireless LAN controller, or autonomous AP, or whatever it's going to be. And here you could create your own custom thing. You could say, 5508 wireless LAN controllers, newer than 2010. However you want to identify these, and then you would just need to call them out. Either probably by IP address. So I could just list every IP address that would fall into this category, or I could match on these the device name or device groups as configured up in the network resources up there. But that would be a really customizable way of doing things with a device filter. So you could use the device filters if just the inherent network device groups of device type and location wasn't getting the job done. But most of the time, that'll do the job for you. The other time where device filters is really handy for me is, let's say that I'm not allowed to manually add in each individual network device. I'm forced to use the default network device because of whatever the criteria is. This is how I can get around that, because now I can say, okay, well, I can't specify that it's a wireless LAN controller for the network device, but here I could create a group called wireless LAN controllers and then just identify each IP address that would fall under that. And that's a way to kind of get around that limitation of using that default network device group. Okay, so that's kind of matching on the device that it's coming from. Another common thing that you want to match on is information about the user that's actually authenticating, or the machine account that's authenticating, whether it's a user or machine authentication. So let's talk about those. We'll head back down to our authorization here. And we'll hit our customize. So if we want to match on user information, excuse me, what are some common things that we would want to match on? Well, oftentimes group membership. Well, depending on where we're authenticating it against, we have a number of different identity stores that we can authenticate, validate those credentials against. There's the internal users identity store within ACS. ACS can reach out to Active Directory or LDAP. We could be using certificate authority for ETLS type authentication. So we have a few different ways of matching off of that user information, but we'll look at the kind of common ones. So group membership. If it's an internal user, then what I'm looking for is identity group. This would be matching group memberships for any user in the internal ACS users store. If it's an Active Directory, you'll see once you add Active Directory in, you'll automatically get this option of AD1 external groups. So that would be Active Directory group memberships. Until you add Active Directory, you won't see that option. So if you're just popping in an ACS and looking for that and it's not there, it's just because you haven't added ACS into Active Directory yet. If you had LDAP, you'd see one for LDAP. I think it's member of or group membership, something to that effect. What else can we use for group memberships? If you're doing ETLS, that one gets a little trickier to try to match on. These are usually the two things that we're doing for user-based authentication, is either a group membership based off of the internal or Active Directory. And once you choose that, you want to create a rule. Obviously, it can't be in both. Either a user is in the internal repository or it's in Active Directory, so you'd only be able to choose one. They're mutually exclusive. So you would go ahead and call out the group. Again, we have the operator of in or not in. With Active Directory, you are forced to choose a subset of groups. So you're not going to see every single Active Directory group in here, and you can't just manually type in a name. So you only see what groups that you've specifically called out when you added ACS into Active Directory. So I called out 4 different groups. So I could choose any one of these groups. I could actually choose multiple groups. So I could say, if it contains any of these groups, the user could be in domain users or Active Directory group 1, or it could be force them to be in both of these groups. So you could do ands or ors with that. We don't have the same option with an internal group, because an internal user can only be a member of one group at a time, as opposed to Active Directory. They can be a member of many groups at a time. If you don't see the group for Active Directory that you want to see here, let me show you where you can make sure to add that. Let's discard my changes real quick. You would head up to your identity stores, go into Active Directory on your external identity stores, and you want to go to directory groups, and here's where you specify every group that you would want to use in a rule. And so typically you would either just specifically call out the group in this full URL style here, or you can hit select and it'll pop up a list and you would just say, okay, this group, this group, this group, boom, now I can use those in a rule. Those are the most common things that we're matching on for users. But let's say that we want to get maybe a little more granular. Let's head back to our access policies. I'm going to introduce something called the compound condition. So let's go with customize again. And we're going to add the compound condition. The compound condition is actually kind of a catch-all. It's really flexible. You can match on almost anything possible in ACS with this. But it's not real pretty when you see it written out in the rule. So typically if I don't need to use it, I won't, but it's always an option. So if we create a rule with the compound condition, check the box, and we have all these different dictionaries that we can look for information in. So we have AD, Active Directory, certificates. So let's say I want to look at a specific piece of information in a user certificate. We're doing EAP TLS, client provides this certificate up. I want to match on a piece of information in that user certificate. So I could choose certificate dictionary, and now I get all the different sort of options within a certificate, the normal fields. Oftentimes common name is one of the most common ones. That's where you might get a username in there. Subject alternative name, another very common one where you might get usernames in there. But you can match on any little piece of information in that cert. Or let's say you want to actually match on a username. So we're doing something like PEEP or LEAP or EFAS, a non-cert based authentication. But instead of matching on a group membership, I want to match on a specific username. That one's a little trickier, but one option you have for that is, and I have to move this up here so you can actually see the bottom of the list. If you go all the way down to System and select, you'll get some interesting pieces of information that you can match on. One of them, though, is username. So if you want to match on a username, you could do System, username, and then you have an operator, so you have equals, non-equals. You could say it starts with, ends with, contains, not contains. So fairly flexible matching options. You probably want to do equals at this, and you could say something like AD user 1. And then once you get all your information, you click Add to add it into the list below. And once it's in the list below, if we could have multiple pieces of information there. You can create ands and ors and get really, really flexible and granular with this. But we'll keep it pretty simple with just one condition in there. And again, we'd have to match, specify what's the result of this rule, okay. And so now you could match on a username, but most of the time we're just going to match on group membership when we start talking about users or user information that we want to match on. Okay, another one, protocols. So what protocol is the client using when they authenticate? This is another good one to know for the lab. So if we want to match on protocols, usually there's one of two different types of categories that we're going to match on. Oops, sorry, cancel. So we'll go back to our customize, look at our different matching criteria. And it is going to be, if it's an EAP authentication, so any 802.1x style network, it's going to be one of these two, EAP authentication method or EAP tunnel building method. And actually, this will get you through a lot of a few other things too. But basically, if you have an EAP method that is does not have an inner-outer method, so this would be your EAP TLS or your LEAPs, you would find that in the EAP authentication method here. So if you select, so there's your EAP TLS, and there's your LEAP. We have a number of other options that you probably would never really get into. But EAP TLS and LEAP are typically what you're going to look for under here. Tunnel building method, these would be the ones that have both an inner and outer method. So you're going to find EAPFast and you're going to find PEEP under here. So any type of EAP authentication you want to match on, this is really what you're looking for. What other types of authentications can we do? Any type of web auth is going to be actually, most of the time, by default, it's a PAP, at least for the stuff that we do with wireless. So I think that might be, let's try to take a look. Authentication method. I honestly don't try to match on that one too much, so let's see if we can target that one. Authentication method. Yeah, there we go. PAP. So any type of a web auth, guest web that we're kicking out to ACS, or if it's a management GUI. So we're doing radius authentication to get management access into a wireless LAN controller. That's going to come across as a PAP ASCII as well. So that's going to be another common one. The last kind of common authentication method that you're going to use would be sort of a MAC-based authentication. So if you check the MAC filtering box on a WLAN, does the MAC check against ACS, is going to be processed as a host lookup. And the one for that would be, what are you, use case. So use case, there's really only one option under that if I remember correctly. And that would be, host lookup. Host lookup would be MAC filtering, a MAC lookup, any type of a MAC check that's going to be found as a host lookup. So those are your different methods of trying to match on what type of an authentication is it, whether, what type of an EAP authentication, is it a web-based authentication, is it a MAC-based authentication. That's how you can kind of sort those out, matching on the authentication type. Okay, another common one that you would want to know, especially for a CCIE lab, is matching on SSID. So what SSID is the client authenticating or associating up to? There's two ways of matching on this, even though they both actually look at the same piece of information. There's a piece of information called the called station ID. And most of the time people use what's referred to as an end station filter to match on that. So they go up to policy elements. I'll just discard these changes here. And it's these end station filters. Come on. And so I've already created one, but they would create this end station filter matching on this DNIS attribute, and it says if it ends with ACS-pod1, that would match on any client associating up to an SSID called ACS-pod1. Now it's important to note that at least in the code that we talk about with CCIE lab, which is 7.0.70116 code on the controllers, and 12.4.25 DJA on the autonomous APs, we only get this SSID information if the authentication comes from a wireless LAN controller. So we won't ever get the SSID information if it comes from an autonomous AP. If we're talking about something like HREAP, local authentication, where the HREAP AP sends the radius request up to ACS as opposed to kicking it up to the controller and having the controller send it to ACS. If it comes directly from an HREAP AP, we also don't get this. So it has to come directly from a wireless LAN controller. But, so that end station filter is a very common one. So I could just do my little customize here and add in, scroll down, an end station filter. I'll add compound condition because that's the other way of doing it here. Get rid of these other two. All right, so if I create a rule, I could just use that end station filter. So I could say, here's my end station filter. If it matches the end station filter that I configured called ACS-pod1 SSID, then it'll match on that SSID. Or if I don't want to use that, because there is a bug that's inherent, at least in some versions of ACS 5.2, with that end station filter. So the other way to do it is to just actually use a compound condition and just zero in on that actual piece of information. So you'd go to radius IETF is the dictionary, and the attribute is that called station ID. Not calling, but called station ID. Otherwise, calling is the MAC address of the client. And what you would say is it ends with, and then the name of your SSID, ACS pod 1. Added in, OK. Oh, sorry. Choose your authorization profile, and then hit OK. So that would allow you to match on an SSID. And again, this is only going to be available if the authentication comes from a wireless LAN controller. If it comes from any type of AP, whether it's an autonomous AP, HREAP AP, doesn't matter. In our code that we talk about for the lab, we do not get that SSID information in that called station ID field. All right, so that gets you pretty much most anything that you would ever need to worry about for the lab. But let's just talk about just some miscellaneous type of stuff. So let's say you want to match on something different, or you're trying to differentiate between two different authentications that look incredibly similar. You know, they're using the same, they're coming from the same device, and they're potentially using the same protocols. You know, how can we differentiate when they're very, very similar like that? Well, one thing that you can do is actually just do a couple test authentications where, you know, so authenticate one way, authenticate the other way, and then go into the log and just start trying to look and see, okay, what's different in here and what can we match on? Because pretty much anything in the auth log can be matched on in these rules. So let's go ahead and take a look at those auth logs. The auth logs can be found under the main ACS page. You go to Monitoring and Reports, and you click on this Launch Monitoring Report Viewer link. That's going to open up this web page. And on the splash page that you get placed, you know, this is the default page that loads up. Where I go to is I just scroll down to My Favorite Reports, and I'll do Authentications Radius today or Authentications TACACS today, just depending on what type of authentication I'm doing, probably Radius most of the time. You click on that, and then that'll open up another window. And this is going to be your auth log, or at least what I refer to as my auth logs. So this is just a running list of every authentication that has passed through ACS. For this report, it's technically any Radius authentication today. That's what you're going to see on this list here. So you get some high-level information, and that's great. But what you want to do is you want to dig into the details. So once you find the log that you want to dig into, you would click in on the little magnifying glass under the Details column. This is going to bring up the full auth log. And this is going to have pretty much all the information you ever need to know for an authentication. So we have some high-level information in the auth summary here. You can see username, MAC address of the client, what device did it come from, you know, what identity store was used, authentication method, all that type of information. If you go down to authentication details, you're going to get even more information. So you can see that, you know, again, we used EAP-FAST as an outer method for the tunnel method, but the EAP authentication method was MS-CHAP v2, so our inner method was MS-CHAP v2. So you can match on, you know, both of the outer method and the inner method on an auth like this. Or you could come down the calling station ID. This is the MAC address of the client, so you can match on that. The network device, everything about the network device, you know, what's the name of it, what groups is it a member of, what IP address did it come from, you can match on that. Oop, don't go into that. NAS port type. So this information will change depending on the type of authentication, but it's a piece of information that you could match on just in case, you know, it might be a differentiator when authentications look very similar, and we'll actually see this in an example coming up here. Access policy, this is just about, you know, how did it, you know, which access service did it use, why did it use it, you know, where was the user found, and then what rule did it match in your authorization policy. There's not much to match on in here, so you can't look at this for help with your writing your rules, but if we keep scrolling down, we have this other category down here, and we have even more information. So we could look at things like, here's external groups. So this happened to be an Active Directory user. So we can see that it was a member of these 4 different groups. So I can match on any one of these groups. Here's that called station ID that I talked about. So we can see here, the format of the called station ID is the MAC address of the radio of the AP that the client associated to, colon, the SSID. So this came from a wireless LAN controller, so I get that SSID. If this did not come from a wireless LAN controller, I would just get the MAC address, and that would be the end of it. But here's that SSID that we're trying to match on. So all the information that you want to match on is in the auth log. So you can take a look at this if you need help trying to figure out, okay, what should I match on to specifically identify this type of an authentication. So let's go ahead and show you an example of that. Two authentications that look extremely similar, but how would we differentiate them? So let's do an example of WebAuth for a guest account. So we're connecting up to a guest network. We get redirected to a web page, and then we have to log in to the web page for a wireless client, and then trying to do management authentication into the GUI of a wireless LAN controller. All right, so let's go ahead and try this out. Because they're very, very similar, so they can be tough to differentiate in a rule. So let's do this. So we'll connect up to my guest network first, and we'll go through the WebAuth process. So I connected, and I already got an IP address. All right, so I just need to trigger the web redirect. Let's just take 1 minute. It's not too fast. And I have the WLAN configured to use an external radius arrow. So it'll look internally in the controller first. If it doesn't find the user account there, then it's going to reach out to ACS. So I'll use an account that's in ACS. So ACS user 1. It's not on the controller, so this will force it to look out on ACS for the authentication. ACS user 1. Let's try one more time here. And whether it works or not, I don't really care. I just need to get an auth log to look at. So that's really what I'm trying to accomplish at this point. All right. Well, let's just see if we get an auth log for it real quick. Assuming I can configure things correctly. I just have to reload here. And yes, so this PAP ASCII, this should be from my WebAuth client. All right, now I'm going to do one more. I'll do the management WebAuth into WCS1. So if I go over to controller 1, I'm just going to log out and log back in. And again, this is configured to reach out to radius if it's not found locally. So I'll do AD user 1, just a different user count helps keep them separated in the log until I can get more information to figure it out. Okay, so that one logged in. So let's go ahead and take a look at our logs. I just need to reload this one more time. Okay, so this one, the second one on the list, ACS user 1, this would be for my wireless client on a guest WebAuth. The one right above it, management WebAuth. You'll see they look very, very similar. The only difference so far is that one has an IP address, one doesn't, but we can't really match on that very reliably. I mean, we could try, but that's not maybe the best thing to match on. But everything else looks identical, so we're going to have to dig in, look at the details. So let's look at the guest WebAuth one first. Excuse me. So we see, both of them are using PAP ASCII as we saw on the high-level log. So let's keep on going through. We can't really write a rule based off of user group because, well, someone could use a user account in either location. We don't want someone using, an account intended for guest access to log in to a controller with. So we can't really rely on user information because the same user can be used anywhere. So that's not very reliable. Now, with guest WebAuth, the client will have an IP address. So technically, we could try to match on the presence of an IP address versus the absence of an IP address. A little harder to do on there. Let's see if there's other things that we can match on. So we're scrolling down. Okay, so it's coming from controller 1. Both of them are coming from controller 1, so we can't really match on the fact that it's coming from controller 1. But the NAS port information is something we can match off. So we see a port of 1 on the guest web as well as a port type of wireless IEEE 802.11. Now that is actually a decent one to match on that, as we'll see later. Access policy, we can't match on that. Called station ID, again, is just, in this case, it's just the IP address of the client. Again, not the best thing to match on, I would say. But we have other things we could possibly look at. The service type is logon or login, so we'll see if that's maybe different on the other one. Okay, now let's take a look at the management authentication and see, okay, what might be different that we could match on. So everything up here is pretty much going to be the same. We're still using the same protocol, PAP-ASCII. So let's dig in here. So under user, the only thing we see is that there isn't a calling station ID. So again, we could try to match on the absence versus the presence of a calling station ID, but I don't know if that's the best thing to match on. We scroll on here though, we see that there is no NAS port or NAS port type. So since one has had that IEEE wireless 802.11 or whatever it was, that's probably a good field to match on because that's always going to be the same on any type of wireless authentication. So that would be a good one, I would say, to match on to differentiate between the two. Let's scroll down here. What do we have under the other? Service type is actually different. One was login, the other was NAS prompt. So another possible piece of information that we can match on specifically. And this might even be better than what we had up here with the NAS port type because at least on both of these, there's an actual value as opposed to the absence of a value. So, maybe we match on NAS prompt means it's a management authentication where login means it's guest web auth. It would probably be compounded. So if it's PAP-ASCII and NAS prompt, then it's management. If it's PAP-ASCII and login, guest web auth. But this is how you can just go through the logs, and especially if you're not as familiar with the different types of authentications and what pieces of information are in there, just go into the logs. Take a look. Okay, here's all the information I could match on for this one. Here's all the information I can match on for that one. What's different? What's easy to match on? Use that for your rules. And then the last thing we'll talk about with this is trying to figure out, okay, so we're writing our rules, we're matching on different things. How do we know if we're actually matching the rule that we want? Because sometimes what happens is you get unintended rule matching. You just write a rule, it's not specific enough, and so all of a sudden, stuff that's not supposed to match this rule is, or maybe you wrote it wrong, and so you're trying to match this rule, and it's going down and parsing through the rules, gets to the rule you want to match, doesn't match, it keeps on going down, and it matches a rule down here, whatever it is. So let's try, how can you, one, know that it matched the correct rule, and then two, how can you try to troubleshoot when that type of thing happens? So let's go ahead and just write a couple rules real quick here. So I have one matching on this SSID. So let's just write a rule called ACS pod 1 SSID, so it's a little easier to see that this is the name of the rule that I'm matching. I could create another rule, say, let's get some more matching criteria real quick. Let's do a quick group membership. Create another rule and just say it's ACS group 1. And then we'll just do a couple, just do a test auth and we'll just see how we can tell what we were matching, what rule we were matching. Oop. Wrong button. One more time. Group 1. Oftentimes I like to write my rules based off of what I'm trying to match. Just makes it a little bit easier to identify. Especially if you have lots of different matching criteria, it can be a little hard to just read it because it's scrolling off the screen when you're just sort of perusing the list. And then I'm going to put this guy up above. Okay, let's just do a couple test auths, get some new logs, and then we'll see how we can see which rules we were hitting. So I'm just going to connect up to, nope, not bridge 1. ACS pod 1, there's my SSID, so I'll do one that's eat fast, and I'll do ACS user 1, so this should hit the first rule, because I'm using an account that's in that ACS group 1. And And I'll do another one that uses an Active Directory group. Actually, I'll just do an EPTLS. How about that? I just need to delete this so I can choose a different auth type. I'll just say EPTLS. Okay, check our auth logs. Oops. Go back to my list here. I do have to reload to get my new logs in here. Okay, so here is the first one. So let's try to figure out. I was authenticating with this ACS user 1 account, and let's just say pretend that I wasn't getting the result that I thought I should. So let's see. Okay, the auth succeeded, but I didn't get the result. So let's try to figure out, okay, which rule did I match, and then what was the authorization profile applied. So you want to go down to authentication details, and you go down to the access policy. And this is going to tell you everything step by step, well, at least it doesn't organize it step by step, but it tells you, you can step by step figure out, okay, how did I make my way to whatever rule it was. So the first thing that happens is you get assigned to an access service. So which access service did I get assigned to? Well, for me, I was assigned to the default network access service. Why was I assigned to the default network access service? Well, because I matched access service selection rule named rule 1. Well, so if I got sent to the wrong default the wrong access service, I could go in there and figure out, okay, well, why did I match rule 1? What is rule 1? I would go to my access policies, my service selection rules, and look and say, okay, I hit rule 1. What's rule 1 do? Well, if it's radius, then I go to default network access. So that's appropriate here, but this lets you know, okay, what rule did you match? And then you go to the rule and you figure out, okay, well, why did I match that rule? Okay, so I got placed in my access service. The next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to authenticate. So it'll tell me which identity policy rule did I use. Well, we just had the default policy rule. So we just used whatever was configured by default. So you can see I was looking in AD1, internal users, internal hosts for my user account. And I see that I landed on the internal users identity store, which my user happened to be in this group. Okay, cool. Then I go to the access, the policy, or to figure out which authorization profile should be sent. So I ended up being assigned the permit access authorization profile. Well, why? Well, because as I went through my rule list, I ended up matching a rule called ACS Group 1. So my authorization policy matched rule was ACS Group 1. Okay, well, this may have been the right rule, maybe it wasn't. So let's go and I can see now in my policy, if I look at authorization, okay, so I see I matched this rule, ACS Group 1. Why did I match it? Well, my account was in ACS Group 1, so that's why I matched that rule, for better or worse. So that's how you can kind of step-by-step parse exactly how you got to the result that you got. Which access service did I get assigned to? Why? Which rule did I match in the access service selection rules? In the authorization, which authorization policy did I get? Why? Which rule did I match in my authorization policy rule list? And then if if it wasn't the correct rule, then all you do is you just look and see, okay, well, based on that rule, let's say I wanted to match ACS pod 1, but instead I matched a rule above it. Well, that means that the rule I wrote above it wasn't specific enough to exclude this other type of auth that I was trying to get down there. So I just need to figure out, okay, well, why did I match this? So I look at the matching criteria. I look at my auth log to see, okay, what's the supporting evidence to show why I matched those different pieces of our criteria. And then I just need to make a tweak. I need more matching conditions so I can match on stuff that excludes this, or maybe I need to reorder my rules so that this rule is above the other rule or whatever it's going to be. But that's how you can use the auth logs to try to figure out which rule did I match, is it the correct rule, and then why was it matched. All the matching criteria in here, you'll see all the information for that in the auth log. So that's pretty much the information I have for you in terms of writing rules, how to match on different types of authentications, and then trying to figure out, for the most common things, and then trying to figure out your own custom stuff that might not fit the normal mold. And then how to use the auth logs as a troubleshooting tool to figure out why you are or are not matching the rules that you think that you should be. Any questions on any of this policy matching conversation? So question, can we have rules that can define only a particular user can log into network devices if that user initiates the connection from a specific laptop or PC? Yes, you can. So you're trying to match on a couple pieces of information there. So a user and a specific device. So those seem to be the two pieces of information you want to match on. So if you want to match on a user, my recommendation usually is to match on a group. So personally, I would create a specific group, and that user is the only member of that group, and then reference the group. Or you could match on the specific user name. So we kind of talked about those, but group. Excuse me. Sorry. If I was going to do the group method, which is what I would recommend, I would either be doing AD groups or the identity group, which would be for internal ACS users. So one of those two. Otherwise, if you want to match specifically on the username itself, that's where I would go into having to use that compound condition. So that will get you the user. Okay, so the device that they're coming from. The device that they're coming from is referred to as an end station. So pretty much the unique identifying piece of information from that would be a MAC address. So I could just use compound condition again on that. Or I could go up, and let me just say my changes real quick. And in your policy elements, you could create an end station filter. End stations would be just clients. And I could create one that matches on a specific MAC address and say, okay, if the end station MAC address, which is the client, is 00112345, which is the MAC address of my client, give it a name. So I'd just write a rule that says, down in my access policies, so if it's in this group, which the user's in that group, or if it's this specific user, and it's the end station is this MAC address, then this is my result. And then, or I could write the converse, outside of that, then the next result is a deny after that, or something to that effect. So definitely you could match on something very specific as that. Now, it's not very scalable, because then you'd have to create these rules for every user device combination possible, and that's just not going to work very well. You just have this massive rule list, and I don't know if you'd probably run into some sort of performance issues after you got thousands of rules going on or something to that effect. But in small instances, it is possible. So it's useful when we have prime managing devices config and using an AD username. Okay, sure, yep. Any other questions on trying to write any rules or different pieces of information you might want to match on a rule? Okay. Well, thanks for joining, and definitely be sure to look for other VU lectures coming down the pipe in the future. Thanks.